Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton, and this is Family Life in the North Country. Today, at least to start with, I'd like to talk to you about divorce. You know, it's growing at an alarming rate. The number of divorces it just skyrocketed, and then it leveled off. But then, why did it level off? Excuse me, it levels off because fewer people are getting married. But also increasing is number of separations and then just plain desertions. You know, most people don't talk about desertions, but that's become pretty common. What is a desertion? That's when people just walk out of a marriage. They don't even bother getting a legal separation or divorce. And when we look at these problems, this new no-fault divorce is rather serious. Excuse me, I did a research study, quite a bit of work on this several years ago, and I found that most people did not want no-fault divorce. They did not want divorce to be made easier. In fact, most people wanted divorce to be made harder to get. And everybody agreed that there should be more preparation for marriage. At the time I was doing the research, people were saying people ought to be better prepared for marriage. But they were not in favor of easy divorce, but the lawyers seemed to be, and the lawyers are the ones that make the money on it these days. But what we're seeing is a so-called no-fault divorce that the lawyers, as a group, got through the legislature in various states, supposedly because it would be less painful. We're seeing that it is painful, and it, as usual, hurts children. When we see people divorce who have children, it goes along with separations and desertions. We know that the children are hurt. It always hurts children. I have a book here about working in therapy with children of divorce by Dr. Gardner. And he says it's always painful. It hurts, damages children. Now, can you imagine? We have two people who make an agreement, who are free to make the agreement, who are legally of age, who are mature, who go to a great deal of trouble to arrive at this conclusion, and they, in effect, sign a contract. Well, everybody would agree that contract is a contract, particularly one that's made so carefully. And in this instance, even has to have state permission to make the contract. Interesting, though, that the courts will come along and say one person now has the right just to walk out on it, just to turn it out. How about this freedom that people are always reaching for? Freedom. People act like they're going to get the freedom. And when they divorce, they often talk about feeling that they can't do certain things. I hear this sort of excuse sometimes. Well, I married so young, and I found out the people I married, well, they may have been 20, 21, 22, married so young, I didn't have an opportunity to really find myself. And so I want freedom. I've heard that recently. I've been hearing it for years, but people who are talking about divorce, talking about separation, freedom to do what? Even if it means hurting children? What happens to the old idea that your freedom stops where it starts hurting me? Freedom of one can't be at the expense of somebody else. I recall in grade school, the teacher was explaining the freedoms, what we had, Constitution, and was talking about my freedom to strike out stops right before it hits somebody else's nose. Well, that's the way it is with divorce. What freedom do people have if they have children? Divorce and separation always hurts children. Many times we see today that people are saying, well, my parents did it to me, therefore I can do it. My parents did thus and so why can't I have that right? Well, children caught up in these situations often feel guilty. It's kind of sad to see a youngster feeling guilty for the parents splitting up. Children put a guilt trip on themselves, thinking and saying to themselves sometimes, well, maybe if I hadn't misbehaved, or if I'd been better, or if I'd have helped Dad or Mom more, well, maybe he or she wouldn't have left. Sometimes children even get the idea that the parents divorce, that I must not be lovable. Why should anybody want to care about me? When you think about a youngster growing up with that attitude, what's that going to do for them in the future? What's it going to do for them in their relationships with other people? Girls with that feeling so often go looking for love. They look for it. We all want to be loved. We all want to be cared for and cared about. You never outgrow that need. But a youngster whose parents have abandoned or divorced may think of herself as not a worthwhile person. And she wants love, so she gets into all sorts of negative relationships looking for love. Boys who feel deserted because they believe they've been bad, well, they're going to look for love and comfort. And where do they find it? Where do these kids find it? Well, they find it in a lot of sex because that's what the media presents. They find it in alcohol. They find it in drugs. Because mom and dad, both, or whatever they did, they like to play like they're adults. Kids like to play like they're adults. It's called pseudo-maturity. It's a phrase that's been put on it for several years now, and I think it's pretty descriptive, pretty accurate. You see youngsters who think if they drink, they're grown up. But really, it hides growing up. It hides maturity. Play like an adult. Sometimes kids are hurting so much, they try to stop the hurt. Maybe even attempt suicide. There is an increase in this sort of thing, and most of it is traceable to problems in families. A few ideas, kids run away. They're trying to run away from pain, and when that happens, you know what happens. They usually get into more pain. They get into more difficulties. They're looking for the same thing. A few kids look it over. They think about it, and they say, well, I'm not going to do that. So they withdraw, and they retreat, in a sense, from the social world where there's pain and people can't depend on somebody. They don't want to look at life that way. They want to look at life as having something positive. So some of them, in spite of it, will turn it around and do a great job. Kids that are playing today in the world and trying to grow up with the media is largely negative when it presents social values. Media has some beautiful educational programs, beautiful, inspiring programs, but it also has some pretty negative stuff, particularly when it presents families. So what's a child going to do? So many people look upon a divorce as, well, I have to get out of this problem. Well, let's look at it a minute. What does divorce fix? What does it fix? If you're courageous enough to try to answer the question, it doesn't fix much, does it? Does it fix lack of love, lack of responsibility, a lack of commitment, weak parenting, having had a bad childhood in the sense of being abandoned or deserted by one's own parents? Well, divorce doesn't fix that. Does it fix financial insecurity or lack of planning, gambling, alcoholism, bad breath? No, when you really get down to it, divorce doesn't really help much. Truth is that most people don't get married easily, casually. You know, let's just look at it. Most people go to a lot of trouble to get married. They get everything they can all lined up to make it a beautiful wedding. And most people are really serious that they really want to marry the person. They're not just a happenstance. You know, there's an old saying, I used to hear it, don't hear it much anymore, but I'm old enough to have heard some old sayings. People say, well, you don't know a person until you live with them. And it was usually in reference to him. You don't know a person until you live with him, because that was a common statement. And so a lot of people try living with the man or the woman as if they're going to learn how to adjust better. But that's not working. That just has a reverse effect. And indeed, people don't know one another, but the saying should be, you don't know one another until you're married. And those who don't live together before marriage make much better marriages, have a much lower divorce rate than those who try it out beforehand. Yes, a lot of folks even say, well, I'm not going to get a divorce. So how do they avoid getting a divorce? They don't get married. A lot of people feel that way. And some of them say, well, what difference does it make as long as I'm happy? Well, they don't get happy. I did a study about 30 years ago comparing people who lived in one state with people who lived in another state. One state had relatively easy divorce, and the other state didn't have any, except for adultery. The purpose of my study was to see whether or not it had an impact on people's happiness. And were people who had easy divorce happier than the people who didn't have divorce? No. I found out it really didn't seem to matter. The people that got divorces didn't seem to be improved or better off. People who didn't get divorces, they didn't seem to be unhappy. So actually the conclusion of my study, a little simplistic, but the conclusion of my study was that people get divorces because it's there. Sort of like the same reason that people climb mountains. Climb a mountain because it's there. So if it's there, it's a thing to do. It doesn't solve problems. Divorce doesn't solve problems. It's much better to try to work and improve a relationship. So what if you were 18, 19, 20, 21 when you got married? You're not that age now. A lot of water has gone over the dam, so to speak. Maturity is a relative thing. This is an attitude more than anything else. I've seen 16-year-olds marry and have a beautiful marriage, have beautiful family life. But I've also seen people who are much older who, because of an attitude, couldn't seem to get used to it. You know, there's another way of looking at marriage. It used to be said, a lot of jokes were said about it, that marriage was an institution. And so people were saying, yeah, but who wants to be in an institution? Well, they said that and they joked about it because they didn't seem to really understand what is an institution. An institution is a set of expected behaviors, but an institution has organization, it has roles, it has definitions, it has purposes. And it had importance. Now, the institution of marriage worked well as long as the people in it carried out their functions. It had security. It had happiness. It had achievements. It had achievements because people expected something to occur. Today's marriages, starting about 1925, that's a long ways back, and started a trend toward being companionable marriages. Companionable. Well, companionable marriage is when people marry, they expect a partner to give them happiness. The husband's supposed to make the wife happy, the wife's supposed to make the husband happy. And of course, then if they don't, then the idea is to get a divorce. The institutional marriage worked. Sure, there were some unenjoyable, unhappy situations, but the majority of them worked, and people found contentment in achieving what they were supposed to achieve in marriage. Rather interesting life when you look at it that way. People gain happiness and they gain pleasure in part because of what they could also see the children do. Compare that style today. I don't know how anybody gives somebody else happiness. Can I make you happy? Probably not. Can you make me happy? Probably not. Not unless I want to be happy, not unless I agree to it. There are a lot of circumstances, a lot of situations about this. It needs to be looked at. This newfangled idea isn't working. And we're not doing the children a real service. We all hear about this national debt, and we can't impose our national debt on our children and grandchildren. And that sounds pretty good to me, that we shouldn't do that. Well, how about this emotional debt? I think we need to look at a lot of different things about marriage and perhaps go back to some basics. Why not get married for a purpose? Why not have life revolving around achieving one's goals? It has entitlements. It also has dues and obligations. There are a lot of things like that that people need to do. Well, I've talked a long time now about divorce, so maybe it's time I divorced at the present time. So I'm Dr. John Middleton. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton, and this is Family Life in the North Country. I have a series of questions today, and maybe I'll have some long answers, maybe some short answers. Here's a question. It says, what does it take to become a sex therapist? Well, mostly a lot of nerve in New York State. If you really get into it, there's no license or certification by the state. There's no board. There's no exam by the government. There are associations if people want to pay the dues, and sometimes that's why associations have certificates. They want to make money for their associations. But most of the time, sex therapists, they're not needed. Most of the time, it's a problem of relationships. I've shared that sort of thing with you before on Family Life in the North Country. I usually do a quick litmus test with people who come to me for marriage counseling, and I ask them about 6 basic areas in order to know what direction we should work on and what direction the people feel that they have problems. And one of the areas is sex. It's not whether or not they're performing or doing a certain amount of sex. It's whether or not it's a problem area, the same as the other areas. You know, most of the time, when it comes out to people are having a problem with their sexual area, it's because of their relationship, social relationship. Very few people just have a problem by itself that way, and it's not a physical thing. Another question. Someone asked me, says, you said you're a consultant. What about? A consultant is somebody who supposedly is an expert, and should be an expert at least. And some people say an expert, somebody 50 miles from home. You're never an expert in your own residence or your own community. But a consultant advises, recommends, does services, may make a diagnosis, may be in a position of having a second opinion or giving second opinions. And that's what usually consultation is about, and it's usually short-term, very brief situations. In human relations, most people are doing the right things, and sometimes they just want somebody else's opinion. Am I really doing what I ought to be doing about this situation? And so consultation is oftentimes about a limited circumstance. Here's another question. Are there any ethics involved in counseling? Yes. There are professional ethics and professional standards, for example, in social work, in psychology, in medicine, in marriage and family counseling, yes. There are standards and professional standards. Most of these, however, are based on procedural ethics. In other words, to do the right thing in the right circumstance. Not many of them are based on personal ethics or substantive ethics. For example, it's perfectly all right to help somebody get a divorce if that's what the person's choice is. Last time talked about divorce. Even though getting and helping a person obtain a divorce may hurt other people, the lives of several people. Principle in professional ethics is basically based on trying to do something in a way that helps the individual, what the individual chooses to do. Well, I don't like it. For example, sometimes professionally, if I have a choice not to help someone do or achieve a particular thing, now professional ethics would say I'd refer them to somebody who will do that. In other words, I have the choice as a professional not to get involved in something I don't want to get involved with. But if I don't want to get involved with it, but I know somebody else who will, then according to professional ethics, I should refer them. Here's another example. If somebody asks me, for example, to help them get an abortion, okay, maybe I don't want to get involved in that. I don't do abortions, so to speak. I don't help people get abortions. Professional ethics would say, okay, but refer them to somebody who will. My position is no, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If, for example, someone comes to me and says, I want to kill myself, and I say, well, I don't do that. I don't help people suicide. But I know somebody who will. I'll refer you to so-and-so. See, it comes out to be the same thing as I look at it. I don't want to get into that. So, no. Somebody comes to me to try to get me to help them do something specifically that I don't believe in. No, I just tell the person. And that is an ethical situation as I see it. Our society today has been operating on procedural ethics, and that's a major problem because so often procedural ethics, when it is lacking any substance, firm foundation, any real basic beliefs underneath, that kind of society doesn't last. We have plenty of evidence over and over again in history. Most people can get by for a short period of time on situational ethics. That's what it is, procedural ethics. Be sure to follow the right procedure and everything will be all right. Well, up to a point. We have too many societies in history, we've known about them, that they've disappeared based on that sort of thing. Societies need to have limits, boundaries, and parameters. It needs to have a set of guidelines in order to maintain discipline and order. That's a basic requirement for any society to survive. And most societies have a core of values, very clear values, to the people in it. And it's been found that societies are more alike than they're different. I'm reminded of a core of values that was established as being present in this society. I think it was published in 1947. John Sergimaki found that in the United States, people believed in certain things. For example, that children should be protected, that marriage was a benefit to both men and women, that childhood should be prolonged, that traditional values should prevail, that most people found happiness by following traditional roles in marriage. Well, those studies back published in 47, based on studies many years, several years before, I wonder how many people would agree to those things today and say that that really represents the American society today. Here's another question. What's the difference between short-term and long-term therapy? The time, and actually the goal. Some people don't want help for big, deep problems. They just want a little bit about a particular situation. They want help for a particular area, for example, jobs, careers, or adjustment to a particular person. So long-term and short-term counseling or therapy depends on what a person wants. It can be stretched out, it can be made quite long, but most of the time it's not needed. There's been a lot of publicity lately about a new book coming out of the publicity in the area that I read in about diagnosing, and the question is, what is diagnosing? Is it helpful? Is it necessary to diagnose somebody? Well, we're getting more and more into the realm of third-party payments. Insurance companies need a diagnosis. They typically won't pay unless there's a specific condition which is being treated. And a label is important. Now, the same diagnosis may be found in people who act quite differently. That doesn't make the diagnosis wrong, but we have to work with the person, not the diagnosis. And the HMOs, these health management organizations, it's going more and more that way. They're trying to focus so that this condition receives this treatment for this amount of money, and put it all together so that life can be simple. Well, some people haven't read the book and they don't know life's supposed to be that simple. So if I don't know how I'm supposed to behave, if I have, for example, a borderline personality, I'm not sure how much the insurance company is going to pay somebody to help me with my adjustments. We treat the people, not the diagnosis. Unless, and there are occasional situations where a particular diagnosis or a particular symptom points in an immediate direction, call it pathognomonic, in which people have to be treated for that because it's going to have some bad circumstance. On the other hand, researchers need diagnosis, they need parameters, they need definitions. The people who administer programs need to have some kind of handle on what's going on. And a diagnosis, basically, most of the time is simply a shorthand. It's a shorthand message that professionals use. You find it in any kind of book. Sometimes the language of a profession or trade. They develop words, and that's what it is, so that they can communicate. Speaking of therapy, and speaking of diagnosis, question comes up, what's the most consistent element to be found in helping people? Here's a fancy label for the answer: ubiquitous placebo. Ubiquitous means worldwide, found everywhere. Placebo, something someone believes is going to be helpful, whether or not it actually is. It is helpful. People want help. People expect to change. People hurt, and so they want to get over hurting. And when people go for help, that's the strongest element that helps people to change, is expecting to change. Talking about change, I heard a little story the other day about a minister at a wedding, and he was looking at the bride-to-be and said, "Do you, Sally, take this man for better or for worse?" Sally looked at him. "He ain't going to get any better, and he couldn't get any worse, so I guess so." Well, what are people willing to settle for? For example, Sally may have been quite happy with old Joe when he got married because she looked at him and said he ain't going to get any better and he can't get any worse. But maybe 20 years later, she's not willing to settle for that. Maybe something has changed in her. Maybe she's matured a little bit more. Maybe she has expectations that are a little different. Maybe she finds she's not as dependent as she used to be. There are all sorts of variables. So sometimes people are looking for change, and what they're really looking for maybe is a reassessment of their own attitude. Why do I feel the way I do today? the old boy, that old Joe in that marriage, and said, well, I don't know why she does that. I haven't changed a bit. Well, if he's worked hard not to change, that may be the problem. Heard another story the other day about a state trooper. He's running down the highway and he saw this trucker who was really going down the road at a big clip, and he thought, well, I'll give him a little warning, just slow him down. So he flipped his lights on and the trucker sped up. And the trooper thought, well, that wasn't what I wanted, but I'll give him another warning. So he turned the siren on, and when he did that, the trucker sped up again. The trooper didn't have any choice. He really then had to stop him. So when he stopped him, he asked him, he said, well, why in the world did you speed up? I was just going to give you a little warning. You were too much over the speed limit. And the trucker said, about 6 weeks ago, my wife ran off with a trooper, and I thought you were going to bring her back. Well, people look for change sometimes, all sorts of change. What helps people most? Warm, kind, considerate, supporting relationships. That's what helps people most. That sounds a little bit like motherhood. Well, maybe it is. We haven't changed a whole lot. Here's another area. Questions, and a whole series of questions. You know what? I think I'll save them for another time. Dr. John Middleton, Family Life in the North Country. Have a good day.